Friends, good evening. Welcome you all to the 30th lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series, organized by New Socialist Initiative. This is Subhash Gatade. Our guest this evening is Professor C P Chandrasekhar, Research Director at International Development Economics Associates and a former Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. We feel honored that he agreed to deliver this lecture. He will be sharing his views on federal fracture, a nation in crisis. Professor C P Chandrasekhar has published widely in academic journals and is the co-author of Crisis as Conquest, Learning from East Asia, 2021, Orient Longman. Here is a list of few of his other publications. When Governments Fail, a Pandemic and its Aftermath with Professor Jayati Ghosh, Interpreting the World to Change It, Essays in honor of Professor Prabhat Patnaik, After Crisis, Adjustment, Recovery and Fragility in South Asia, that was also with Professor Jayati Ghosh. The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, 2002. Professor Chandrasekhar received his MA and PhD economics from JNU, where he served as a professor from 1997 until his retirement. He is a member of the executive committee at International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, and the World Economic Association, as well as a contributor to Frontline, Economic and Political Weekly, and Business Line. Professor Chandrasekhar received the Malcolm Adishashaya Award for 2009 for contributions to economics and development studies. Friends, please welcome Professor C P Chandrasekhar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I must thank the organizers, Subhash Gatade, Ravi Sinha, and others, and all of you for being here to engage with me on this issue. This is an issue, as you know, has become particularly relevant in recent times because of the kind of, at least the perceived kind of attack on state governments and cultural, educational, and language policy in different states. And given that attack, it's taken on a hue which seems to have actually intensified the degree to which there's a perception that there is an actual tendency for a party dominating the center, in this case, of course, the NDA coalition led by the BJP, to, in multiple ways, establish control over political and economic operations in the states, and more importantly, to use that to achieve a larger agenda, which goes into homogenizing in multiple ways, homogenizing in a religious sense, in a cultural sense, in a linguistic sense, and to achieve that on the basis of this control. Now, many of you are very familiar with this, and what I really want to do is not really go into all of these aspects, the multiple conflicts, which are there. We know, of course, that the conflicts on the mobilization, utilization, or deployment of resources, or financial resources. There's conflicts over decision-making on central spending and the attribution of projects, which are actually undertaken in the jurisdiction of state governments, whether they be of the same party which governs the center or not. There are conflicts about the role of governors and legislative autonomy, which have become particularly sharp in recent times in states like Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Kerala, and so on. There's been a significant conflict on educational policy and on the governance of educational institutions located in states. There's, of course, the more recent sort of sharp controversy on language policy, which is a revival of controversy which was there earlier. And more recently, there's the controversy on the delimitation of constituencies through a mechanism which actually, it's very obviously, would only result in a situation where certain states of the country would be reduced in terms of their representation in parliament, with attendant implications for the kind of political control we have in the country. So there are multiple such conflicts going on, and what I really want to do, of course, is, given my own capabilities, is really to focus on the issue of fiscal federalism, not just to focus on fiscal federalism in the conventional way in which it has been understood, as I shall explain, but really to see it as one part of this larger tendency and what role it plays within this larger tendency, this larger tendency at political domination over the states. Now, if we go back into the discussion of fiscal federalism, there was, in some sense, and we have an inherited tendency to see political centralization, which is a process of concentrating decision-making with the center that erodes the political and social autonomy of the states, including the legislative autonomy of the states, was seen as running sort of parallel to, and to a certain extent being separated from, economic centralization. And economic centralization was, of course, the process of concentrating the mobilization of resources and decisions on the allocation of those and utilization of those resources in the hands of the state. Okay. And these were seen, as I said, partly as sort of separate elements. But increasingly, these two aspects, I'd like to argue, of center-state conflict have begun to get merged with significant implications. Fiscal centralization has evolved into a mechanism to establish political domination in the states by a party ruling at the center. Okay, and that's broadly what I want to sort of get to. Now, the potential for conflict in terms of center-state economic or fiscal relations was of course recognized in the Constitution, which by the Constitution makers saw the fact that if you have some kind of a notion of the preferred allocation of responsibility with respect to the mobilization of resources and to the deployment of those resources for development purposes, that the mobilization of those resources should largely be in the hands of the center for reasons relating to efficiency, cost of collection, effectiveness, and so on. And on the other hand, given the principle of subsidiarity, given the closeness to the problems of the people at large, lower sort of rungs of administration. And here, of course, I would be looking largely at state governments and not really municipalities and Panchayati Raj institutions. That development responsibilities largely lay with them, so that you had this. It was recognized that there is therefore in this federal structure an element of asymmetry, which is reflected in the fact that if you take let's say a couple of years back, something like 37% of the combined revenue of the center and the states were collected by the state. But on the other hand, 62% of the expenditure on development spending was actually undertaken by the state. So there's this very significant asymmetry. It's almost like 37-62 is like virtually saying that there's a complete it's completely there's a complete lack of correspondence there. So the concern, therefore, in the Constitution and subsequently was with making adjustments to the devolution, or sort of arriving at a system of devolution of resources, which was fair in terms of correcting for this asymmetry, but not merely correcting for this asymmetry in terms of vertical devolution, as we all know, but also in terms of ensuring that correction does not result in a situation where resources get concentrated in the hands of states which are more developed than others, so that there was a need for a certain degree of fairness and a recognition of the differential development requirements in different states, depending upon the state they were in. So you needed a set of principles which would govern both vertical devolution and horizontal devolution, and a mechanism which ensured that those principles were fair. And that was what the Constitution, in some sense, we know, put it down. Now, basically, that at the end of it, we had, more or less speaking, four sort of kinds of flows from the center to the states. I'm not going to be looking here at horizontal devolution, but only at vertical devolution. And these four consisted in of distribution of greater distribution of spending responsibilities, associated with which there was a certain kind of transfer of resources from the center to the states. One, of course, was that there was the statutorily defined share of the states in a defined set of tax revenues of the center, which, of course, was widened over a period of time, with the principles governing that share to be decided by a president-appointed finance commission once in 5 years. they were to arrive at this formula, which was to try and get to fair devolution or sharing of resources between the center and the states, Article 275, Article 280, etc. But the main thing is that that the perception was that independent of the way these finance commissions were constituted, that they would be relatively independent and fair. That was what the structure was intended to achieve. The second was that there were a set of finance commission mandated grants. So the finance commission would decide on a certain devolution of resources. Given that devolution of resources and some kind of a normative assessment of what would be the spending requirements and spending patterns in the state, if there was a revenue deficit in excess of resources accruing to the states, both through their own state taxes as well as from what is devolved from the center, if there is a significant deficit relative to or shortfall relative to the expenditures, normative expenditures which are estimated, there were to be a set of grants which normally therefore get called fiscal deficit grants to try and close the gap, which results as a result of utilization of this formula, which may not be fully adequate in terms of ensuring that there is no significant shortfall of revenues relative to expenditures. Okay. The third flow, now these in both of these cases, once the Finance Commission gave its recommendations, the idea was that the resources basically devolved to the states as per those principles or those formulae. And given that devolution resources, the responsibility for utilization of those resources, of course, lay with the state governments, because they were supposed to be in a position to be able to decide how to utilize these resources. Now, the third flow, which was of course a central share of expenditure in what were called centrally sponsored schemes. And centrally sponsored schemes are schemes in which are largely which are supposed to be joint schemes of the center and the state with joint responsibility for meeting expenditures. It used to be largely 60-40. Now it has been adjusted in some instances where the states even outlay 50% of the total expenditure. But despite this sharing of expenditures, the principal responsibility of the design of these programs was central. I mean, was with the center. And these were called centrally sponsored schemes because they had that implicit design responsibility. But on the other hand, they did not actually provide all of the money required for these schemes because the financing of it was shared with the center. So some of the resources which accrued to the states in the form of either their own taxes or in the form of devolved taxes from the center to the states as per Finance Commission formula, or because of the borrowing that they undertake in order to finance the expenditures. Some of those expenditures will have to be allocated to these schemes to the extent that they choose to utilize these schemes. And of course, 50% or 60% of that expenditure would come from the center. And finally, there were a set of vertical flows which from the center to the states, which came in the form of central sector schemes. And central sector schemes are schemes which are fully funded by the center and are completely designed by the center and are just implemented. They basically, since there is no national jurisdiction, as it were, in which all expenditures are planned and undertaken, every jurisdiction is also state jurisdiction. This is basically saying that central sector schemes are schemes which are undertaken by the center in the jurisdiction of state governments, the political jurisdiction of state governments, but which are designed and completely fully funded by the center. So we had these four kinds of transfers, but of course these were the transfers which we can say are through the routine official channels. There are of course other transfers. There's transfers in terms of lending by the banking system, lending by what used to be the earlier development banking architecture, and so on and so forth. The IDBIs and ICICIs and so on before they were converted into banks and partly privatized or now going to be privatized, etc. But I'm really looking at this sort of official structure of the flows, of the devolved flows. Now, if you look at this framework which is found that there were certain implicit perceptions in the discourse that surrounded the discussion on what should be the framework to be able to ensure a fair distribution, which actually addresses the asymmetry between the mobilization of resources or the preferred mobilization of resources and the preferred allocation of development responsibilities to the central and state levels. So the first thing was that, that really the issue which you're trying to address, it seemed to suggest, was that was one of competition for resources, that the center would, of course, try to compete and keep for itself or obtain for itself a larger share of the resources, whereas the states need it because of the fact that they have far larger development responsibilities. So you were trying to adjust this competition for resources and spending power, which was seen as being embedded in this kind of a sort of quasi-federal framework. And therefore, the implicit perception was that the strains in fiscal federalism were not politically motivated strains. They were strains. They essentially came because of the fact that I wanted to do certain things and I need certain resources. If I give too much resources to the states or the what do you call it? The Finance Commission, mandates me to give these resources to the state, then I lose the control over that. So I need to find or think of ways in which I could, to a certain extent, try and keep for myself a larger share of resources. So it was seen as a competition between resources. The second perception which underlay this is that it actually dissociated, and I think that is important for what I would like to say a little while later, that it dissociated the question of the total amount of resources which should be mobilized. What given the level of the potential economic surplus in these unequal class-ridden societies is, and what should be the actual amount of surplus which should be mobilized relative to that potential. How do we move the system towards being able to mobilize all of those potential surpluses for developmental purposes? And a large part of it concentrated in public hands because of the fact that the expenditures have to be undertaken for multiple reasons by the public sector or the state. That question of the overall amount of resources not to be mobilized was separated from the question of the distribution of the resources between the center of the states. It's somehow said that these are two different issues, and we're not concerned with the first. When we are discussing this issue, we are only concerned about the second. Okay. The third, of course, what I mentioned already, was that the perception in the discourse was that the finance commissions, independent of the way they're constituted, and by the fact that the center is the one who prescribes, or the president, but of course the center, prescribes the terms of reference of each finance commission, that despite this, they were seen as independent agents, that they would actually look to the interests of all, the center, the states, and individual states relative to each other. And of course, over time, we know that for multiple reasons, including the kind of people who came to, not in all finance commissions, but in many finance commissions, came to be nominated as members of this finance commission by the center, because that was the way in which the decision was taken of who would sort of be members of the finance commission. But there was reason to believe that these are not completely independent entities in any sense. Okay. The fourth perception was that to the extent that there is competition between the center and the states for whatever kitty of resources is available for development, that the finance commissions could actually take care of the problem of the asymmetry in a very fair way. And finally, a part of till the planning commission existed, a part of the transfers from the center to the states, which didn't occur through the finance commission, actually occurred, which was partly how central sector schemes and so on, or centrally sponsored schemes, etc., came to be allocated, now decided upon and allocated. But the understanding was that since there were a set of plan grants which were to be given by the states based on what was called the Garnered formula, which took many things into consideration, population, income, etc., that the states, through the National Development Council, and of course their consultation at the Planning Commission level, that the interests of the states would be accommodated even when there are discretionary transfers from the center to the states, which are outside the framework of the Finance Commission, which are the latter two which I mentioned, particularly, that is the transfers through centrally sponsored schemes and central sector schemes. So overall, the idea was that we put together this thing both in terms of discretionary transfers, official discretionary transfers, and statutory transfers, which occur through the Finance Commission. We have worked out a system which is not going to be perfect, but at least is one which would be relatively fair. And there was the idea that neither should the government nor should the opposition of the state government, I mean the central government or the state governments or the opposition, question what was recommended by the Finance Commission. It was best that it's just accepted because this is what the constitution makers wanted. Now, the thing is, what really was the impact of Finance Commission decisions? We've had 15 Finance Commission. The 16th one is going about its visits to the different states and would be submitting its report and making its recommendations in a few months' time. So the thing is, if you look at what really was the consequence of these finance commissions, and on the surface, it appears that things have actually helped the states. And how is this argued? This is argued on the basis that if you take the share of the states in total taxable receipts of the union, as recommended by the consecutive commissions, and I'm not going back to the first one, but supposing we start from the 11th Finance Commission, at the time of the 11th Finance Commission, over 29% of the gross tax revenues were devolved. And that over a period of time rose, and it rose to 42% in the case of the 14th Finance Commission, and then came down to 41% because following the absorption of the conversion of Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory, the 15th Finance Commission kept aside 1% of those revenues for J&K. So 42 became 41, but in essence, it was still 42. So you had this increase from about 29% to 42% between 2005, which was the last year of the 11th Finance Commission, and 2026. You saw this increase in share. Now, the thing is, as people who study this have pointed out repeatedly, and it's common knowledge now, that actually the increase which occurred with the 14th Finance Commission to 42% from 30-something percent was partly statistical. It was statistical in the sense that earlier the Finance Commissions essentially allotted, or looked at basically the revenue account, the non-planned revenue account. Because we have, even within the revenue account, you have a capital account and a revenue account. But even within the revenue account, you had planned expenditures and non-planned expenditures. And finance commissions used to look only at non-planned expenditures partly because of the fact that the context was one in which there was there was planning going on. There was a planning commission in place. There was the use of the Gatkell formula. So what needed to be covered in terms of meeting developmental responsibilities was the non-planned part of it, those kinds of development expenditures and social expenditures. And therefore, this is what was estimated. And then there was another amount which was going. Now, what obviously, you don't have any automatic flow which is occurring to the Planning Commission because the Planning Commission doesn't exist. And the Niti Aayog, which is supposed to have replaced it, doesn't have any financial powers. So the idea was that if you actually look at what was the amount of resources which was flowing through the Planning Commission process, the discretionary transfer which is occurring, but based on the Gatkell formula, then you'd see that something like the amount which went was something like 20% of the divisible pool of taxes with the center. A significant amount of money which was going through, amounting to about 20% of the pool which is now being shared between the center and the states. And that had disappeared. So that if you actually look at it, the increase to 42%, some have argued, actually did not even neutralize for the loss of the money which occurred as a result of the end of the planning commission based process. So it is actually statistical. So this idea of using these numbers to say the states have benefited a lot over a period of time is not really based. There was a sort of sudden break with the 14th Finance Commission, a leap in numbers. There was a small increase prior to that, but it basically was one in which there was no complete neutralization of the loss which occurred as a result of the ending of the discretionary transfers as planned grants through the Planning Commission. Okay. So now, once we don't then focus on those numbers, what we have is some kind of a situation of which there has been there's evidence of diminishing devolution. And this diminishing devolution, as you all must, all of us have read, it's a constant complaint on the part of the states, that the idea was that what you have here is a situation in which what the center is trying to do is to actually move resources out of what is the divisible pool. So there was a notion of the net proceeds of the center, and net proceeds essentially meant that certain taxes were not included in the divisible pool, the share of that kept reducing over a period of time. But there was one set of taxes or imposts, you can say, which actually over a period of time began to become more and more important. These were the cesses and surcharges which the center imposed on the grounds that it needed to impose these cesses and surcharges for very specific purposes. So they were supposed to be targeted taxes imposed, and they were supposed to be temporary in nature. So, if you have let's say, a COVID-induced expenditure increase, you can have a cess which is supposed to be able to take care of that, but you're not supposed to continue with that over a long period of time. But what we actually observed that over a period of time, cesses and surcharges, not only did not disappear. They were not really temporary. Once they came, they lasted for very long periods of time. Even when removed, they were substituted with others, etc. So that was the first thing, that these were not temporary in nature. And the second thing, of course, is that these were not necessarily targeted. And a classic example of this is, of course, these cesses on petrol and petroleum products, which were imposed to garner resources for what was called the Central Road Fund. And the idea was that you impose a cess on petrol and diesel, etc., obtain those resources and use it to build roads and highways and so on, so that you actually have better transportation now, which would actually reduce fuel consumption, etc. So that was the idea. You take it. Now the point is, in 2018, the central government decided that no, we shouldn't just call this the Central Road Fund. Let us call this the Central Road and Infrastructure Fund. Move it out of the Ministry of Highways and bring it under the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance should be given some flexibility in terms of the way in which it's going to utilize these resources. So it need not only be for roads and highways and so on. It could be used for social infrastructure projects, or it could be used for other kinds of projects like investment in the railways and the power sector and so on and so forth. So you gave, you actually handed over to the state a set of taxes, to the center, a set of taxes which need not be shared by the states, but which increasingly was flexible in terms of what it could be deployed for, even though the reason why you were not sharing it to the states was because it was supposed to be targeted imposts aimed at financing targeted expenditures. Okay. Now, what is the experience of that? If you look at the share of revenues from cesses and surcharges, the increase in these began earlier. Of course, some of them were warranted, maybe in different circumstances, but they stood at about 11.5% at the end of UPA1 and remained at that level to the end of that term. I mean, at the time of UPA1. Under UPA2, from about 11.5%, 11.6%, it went up to about 12.4% of the total revenues. So not much of an increase. But in the first year of the Modi government, it went up, of course, to 13.5. It came down slightly to 12.2, but then rose consistently to reach levels of 20% or more, which is a huge amount relative to gross tax revenues, which need not be shared by the states. So you actually, one consequence of this is that the gap between what should be the share of central taxes which are devolved by the states, if you look at the numerical figure prescribed by finance commissions and the actual figure which was realized in practice, because a part of the tax revenues of the center were taken out of the divisible pool through things like the cesses and surcharges, you actually found that the gap between the two, between the actual devolution and the prescribed devolution, the actual devolution, rose from about 4.1 percentage points to something like 7.2 and 9 percentage points but during the 2015-20 and during 2020-24. So there's been an increasing shortfall in terms of what is given to the states from what the center mobilizes in taxes by adjusting the nature of the taxation. Okay. So if you look at it, the state's share in gross tax revenue as a percentage dropped from about 32% in 2019-20, which itself was lower than what the EFC recommended, to about 29% by 2021. It recovered slightly subsequently, but it's in 2024-25, it was around about 32%. That was what it was, as compared to the 41% or 42%, which is recommended by the 14th Finance Commission, which is the year in which we are. Okay. So you begin to see this. You begin to see see a tendency which is emerging for a squeeze in these revenues. And you can say that, okay, this is part of the competition for resources in which the center is actually using some kind of accounting tricks to be able to win a larger share. But the other thing which was happening is that there is also evidence over a period of time, and this is related to something which I'll say in a moment, which was a substantial increase in the non-tax revenues of the center. Now, if non-tax revenues don't have to be saved, non-tax revenues can be profits of public sector enterprises, etc. But the reason why non-tax receipts, as they are called, they're not really revenues, some of them, is because one, of course, was what came from disinvestment. Even if the land for a public sector project had been taken over from a state, had been provided by a state government, you actually found that when that entity was privatized, if it was a central public sector undertaking, the money obviously went to the center. It didn't go to the state. They were not compensated for the land which was being sold as part of that process. The second was, of course, profits and surpluses which were transferred from cash-rich public sector enterprises like the oil companies, etc. So you actually said that, okay, now we're going to get larger and larger dividends. And in fact, it is true that there are a large number of loss-making, but if you look at it in terms of the profits of the profit-making public sector enterprises, they are huge. And you basically now started taking special dividends and transfers, which were, from the telecom, and earlier from the telecom companies, from the oil companies, etc., which constituted another additional element of non-tax revenue receipts. And the third, more recently, were these huge transfers from the Reserve Bank of India surpluses. Now, what is a surplus of the Reserve Bank of India? I mean, it's not running an economic activity which can make a profit. It's just seigniorage of a kind, So that really relates to an accounting system in which you're saying that, listen, this emerges out as a surplus, and it just lies there in the balance sheet of the central bank. Okay. And now suddenly you have huge transfers. So if you look at 25-26, we're talking about something like 3.25 lakh crores being transferred. Transferred from the RBI to the center. And that's a huge amount of money which is coming, and of course, which is not going to be shared. Even though the central bank is not only a central bank of the central government, but of the nation as a whole, it actually goes into the fund of the central government, which is used for its expenditures. Okay, and that's been increasing. This figure quoted was something like a 12% increase relative to the previous year. So the flexibility which the center has to spend actually increases over a period of time, one by adjusting for the structure of taxation or the composition of taxation, and the other by relying on, sometimes even on on what are called windfall gains, but which last over a period of time. For example, the revenues from the sale of spectrum, which are paid in annual fees over a period of time by the telecom companies, and they're huge. So the spectrum fees go to the center. The states don't get any of it. The privatization receipts go to the center. The transfers from the public sector public sector enterprises with special dividends goes to the center, and transfers from this Reserve Bank of India also goes to the center without any share of the states. So we can see that there is a tendency which is occurring, in which there is a concerted push which got accelerated under the NDA. And that is important to recognize. It got accelerated under the NDA to increase the amount of resources which is retained by the center out of its receipts or its revenues, and gives it greater flexibility in the deployment of this. Okay. Now, it is in the midst of this occurring that another shift, because we really can't understand what is the shift in in fiscal federalism achieving, unless we examine the changing context in which these shifts are occurring. And the second major element in terms of the change in context was, of course, the embrace of neoliberalism, starting from the middle of the 1980s, and then, of course, accelerating after the 1990s. How did this matter? It mattered in multiple ways, of course. Basically, it mattered because of the fact that trade liberalization meant not only that you allowed imports of commodities which earlier you had quantitative restrictions on, but you actually reduced tariffs, began significantly reducing peak rates and also average rates of tariffs over a period of time. And now you're going to reduce it even more because that's the demand which is coming from the United States. So you're actually going to have a situation where a chunk of revenues is actually going because of the fact that you moved into an era of neoliberalism, a neoliberal policy regime. The second aspect of neoliberalism was, of course, fiscal conservatism. That basically, not only did the center itself pass a Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which required it to reduce its fiscal deficit to GDP ratio and try and therefore limit its debt finance spending. But we know that in practice, despite the FRBM Act, there have been constant deviations between the centre's fiscal deficit and the fiscal deficit it had promised to get to much earlier. And the point is now, in fact, they've said that the principle should change. All we should be bothered about is the debt to GDP ratio. We needn't be bothered about the fiscal deficit. So I should have the flexibility to adjust my fiscal deficit and spend or borrow, so long as I don't exceed some ceiling or cap or large target of the debt to GDP ratio. That's what matters, and not the fiscal deficit. But while this was the nature of fiscal conservatism associated with neoliberalism in center, partly but through pressure from the center, very often exerted through the terms of reference and therefore the recommendations of finance commissions. Fortunately, that's not been clearly specified in the 16th Finance Commission as it was in previous finance commissions. There was a pressure to actually get the states also to implement this, and the states implemented their own. Each state has its own Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, all of which have something like 3%, the ceiling which you need to get to in terms of your fiscal deficit, set at 3% of the state's GDP. And that becomes a benchmark for the center, because when a state borrows, if the state already has any outstanding dues to the center, it cannot go to the market and borrow without going to the center and saying that, listen, I need permission from you to borrow because I'm going to borrow and increase my debt. And that I know I owe you some money, and that might influence my ability to pay you on my past indebtedness. But please give me the permission. So the center has the right to say yes or no. Now, this is actually this is being now weaponized to actually say that, oh, you got your Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, you embraced neoliberalism, you said 3%, even though there was pressure through the finance commissions to do it. And therefore, you set this limit as being the limit, you make it the benchmark. Now, even in periods when, for particular reasons or circumstances, like during the COVID period, when you tend to allow the states to borrow more, you say that, okay, forget your 3%, maybe you can go to 4%, or you go to 4.5%. That comes with conditions. It comes with conditions with respect to, for example, electricity reform and electricity pricing. It comes with conditions with regard to one nation, one ration card. It comes to conditions of adopting ease of doing business policies, and so on and so forth. You make those the conditions. That is, you use your right to actually give permission to the states, because they are already indebted to you, which is normally the case, to determine whether they can borrow more, to actually use that to actually get the states to move further down the neoliberal path, which of course affects the ability of the state to be able to undertake development expenditures of various kinds. Okay. Now, so now the thing is, this kind of restriction on borrowing has now been taken to an extreme level. It has been taken to an extreme level, say in the case of a state like Kerala, where you're basically saying that even borrowing, which doesn't really go into the consolidated fund of the state government, which is, for example, small savings schemes and so on, that which earlier the states had freedom to use, that these have to be included in total borrowing. But more importantly, if you try to find a way of sidestepping the borrowing limit, and normally, how does the center sidestep borrowing limits? It sidesteps borrowing limits with off-budget borrowing. So you get the National Highways Authority of India to borrow to invest in highways. So you don't have to show that borrowing in the center's budget. So that's not part of the center's borrowing. So you sort of push the system into off-budget borrowing. You get the Food Corporation of India to go out into the market and borrow money, etc. So you have a large amount of off-budget borrowing. So which is part of the public sector borrowing requirement, but which doesn't get included when you're assessing the degree to which the center is actually sticking by its fiscal deficit norms. Okay. Now, in the case of, say, a government like Kerala, which decided that it would set up a Kerala Infrastructure Investment Fund Board, and basically it said that, listen, there are two of my taxes, impost on motor spirit and some part of some other taxes will, by law, through legislation, which will constantly, a certain percentage of it, all of it will devolve to the KIFB, to the Kerala Infrastructure Investment Fund Board. And leveraging that profile or that strain of revenues it's going to get, it can go to the market and borrow and undertake investments in infrastructure of various kinds, not just roads and so on, but also on school infrastructure, on health infrastructure, etc. And basically, it does this by going and borrowing, and it even issued masala bonds, rupee bonds in international markets to mobilize money, and was quite successful in doing it. And suddenly, through the CAG, which is supposed to be also an independent agency, you actually get a report prepared which says that no, this is violating the FRBM Act of the state, and this is therefore not acceptable and should be included in the total borrowing because it's partly backed up by a budgetary transfer of a small percentage of the taxes accruing to the state government through its own taxes to KIFB. So you're squeezing the ability of the states to borrow while you maintain a certain degree of flexibility as far as the center is concerned. Now, what happens if you have a squeeze of this kind which comes? What happens with the squeeze of this kind comes is that it basically means that in the four types of flow I said, the flow which is coming through the Finance Commission in the form of shared resources, the flow which is coming through the Finance Commission in terms of revenue deficit grants, because now you're actually putting a ceiling on deficits directly. In fact, states are expected to show a primary surplus, that is a revenue surplus independent of interest payments. And then you're basically saying that those transfers become less and less over a period of time. And therefore, the ability of the state to undertake its own expenditures based on its own decision making, because that actually is resources which goes to the states and it can decide what kind of development expenditure it wants to finance. But on the other hand, it becomes dependent what? It becomes dependent on these central sectors, centrally sponsored schemes and central sector projects. So what are these sort of these projects? You basically have in centrally sponsored schemes, welfare expenditures through initiatives such as the MRN, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Program, the Awas Yojana, the Jal Jeevan Mission, the National Health Mission. All of these are centrally sponsored schemes. The state shares some money, so a part of the limited resources they have now to be given to these if they want to show that they're actually implementing these. And if you don't implement it the way like it happened in West Bengal or happened in schools in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, then you don't get the money. And because you say that, no, you're not following the rules because this is designed by us, even though you're putting in 40% or more of the financing out of your limited resources. And the central sector schemes consist of schemes like PM Kisan, crop insurance scheme, regional connectivity scheme, etc. And schemes of that kind, which are central schemes undertaken in state jurisdictions. The center has increased its expenditure on that from something like 5,21,000 crores in 2015-16 to about 14,68,000 crores in 2023-24. There's a huge increase in central sector schemes, which are schemes completely designed by the center and implemented in the states. And what the center has been saying increasingly is in both of these cases, in as much as we are providing the resources and it's designed by us, you not only cannot change the design, which of course could include things like what should be the facade of ration shops and, because there's food distribution, or what should be printed on the bags and, et cetera, but also includes very specific ways in which the scheme should be done and an attribution. The scheme has to be attributed to the center and in most cases specifically to the Prime Minister. So it is this Prime Minister's Yojana or that Prime Minister's Yojana. So you're basically squeezing the ability of the states to design and to spend on policies or welfare measures that they design by themselves. And you're forcing them to become more and more dependent, partly with their own resources, on schemes designed by the center. And you're trying to say that, no, these are not state schemes, these are our schemes. Now, why does this matter? this matters because of the shift towards neoliberalism. Because what does neoliberalism do? Neoliberalism increases inequality. It increases inequality. And when it increases inequality, and it results in a situation where, whatever you want to call it, growth takes a form which is K-shaped, if at all growth occurs, and so on. So basically, there's a large section of the population which finds that there are high growth figures which are being quoted, but they're not actually part of the benefits of this whole process of growth. So, but the point, we are still functioning well in some kind of a parliamentary democracy. We still have elections of different kinds which are being held regularly, and independent of those skeptics who seem to have some reason to be skeptical about the way in which these elections are conducted. But the fact is that you need to win political support, you need to win voter support. And in a context of a rising inequality associated with neoliberalism, the way in which you tend to do this is through your projects, through your expenditure schemes, in particular through welfare schemes and transfers. And you're saying that, okay, we're going to give 1,500 rupees to every woman, or you're going to give free bus rides, or you're going to give in some cases you give cycles to young girls going to school, etc., etc. You do all of you give a certain amount of free food for those under the National Food Security, falling under the National Food Security Act. So you do all of these things for which you need, of course, resources, because spending in that manner, in a context in which you have an inequalizing growth strategy, which comes as a result of the embrace of neoliberalism, results in a situation in which you actually have the need for resources to spend in order to be able to achieve this. And the fact of the matter is, the states increasingly don't have it. They are dependent on these schemes which come from the center. The center is making sure that they can to a certain increase this, but they're going to make sure that people see these as central schemes, or schemes which are, with the result of the Prime Minister's patronage, rather than as being schemes which are schemes which are being implemented as part of the development responsibilities which were allocated to the state governments under the constitutional frame, in which you had different kinds of division of powers. Okay, now, so therefore, at the end of all this, then of course you had one other major sort of shift which occurred within the frame of neoliberal policy, which was the shift to the goods and services tax regime. Okay, and the goods and services tax regime, what does it involve? It basically was that the states ceded their right to taxing to a central body, which was the GST Council. And they acceded to a structure of the GST Council, which actually gives virtually the center a veto power in decision making. So you can actually prevent anything from happening, and if you want anything to happen at all, you must actually get the center to be able to accept it, and it's only those things which will go through the GST Council. Okay, and what was the whole idea that you said, oh, this is going to be a game-changing shift? It's going to be a game-changing shift because now you're not going to have multiple taxes, you're not going to have cascading effects, and so on and so forth. And this is going to increase the efficiency and simplify the tax structure. One nation, one tax is what they call it. There's multiple taxes out there. But you basically said that what you're going to have is a process by which you are going to be able to achieve an increase in revenues. And they said there might be a period of time when there could be some transitional, some teething problems. So during a 5-year period, we assure you that to the extent that taxes subsumed under GST at the state level, that relative to the revenues which are yielded by those taxes prior to the introduction of the GST regime, if the revenues do not increase from those taxes substituted under GST, that means from GST, by at least 14% compound every year, then to the extent that there's a shortfall in the level relative to a 14% growth trajectory of those revenues, the state, the center, using a compensation levy, would connect some tax revenues and compensate the states for the tax fall. So the states were actually persuaded to actually cede their taxing rights and accept the sort of structure of the GST Council. And that structure of the GST Council was one in which, as I said, the center had a veto power. So they really completely acceded their powers, and they did that. Having done that, they actually found that in every year there was a shortfall relative to 14%. And therefore, they got their compensation. But we know, even a CAG report, which has now in the PAC, you must have read the last 2 days in the newspapers, has the CAG had found that there was delays, not just delays. There wasn't transfer of the promised amount of money even during the period when the compensation principle prevailed. At the end of the 5th year, there was still a shortfall in resources, and the compensation was stopped. It wasn't extended despite the demand of the states. Now, just look at it. What was subsumed under the GST was something like 44% of state taxes, whereas only 28% of central taxes got subsumed. So you're having a very, very unusual thing. You're having a situation in which GST is not delivering what it is supposed to deliver. That has increased the squeeze on the fiscal position of the states. But on the other hand, the shortfall is much less for some strange reason in the case of the center than it is in the case of the states. So this element of the change in the regime or the context in which center-state fiscal relations, which came out of neoliberalism, is embedded, also worsens the situation. Now, this essentially means that what really happens is that if you say that that in some sense, once you have an inequalizing growth trajectory of the kind that comes with neoliberalism and then intensifies over a period of time with rising inequality and a large degree of marginalization of sections of the population from the growth process, then you would end up with a situation where you become more and more dependent to gain political legitimacy, to undertake welfare expenditures of certain kinds, have special schemes for these poor people, because it's still a system of one person, one vote. But what you do is you actually squeeze the states to prevent it from getting access to the resources, which can allow it to do it on its own steam. It can only do it on the basis of centrally sponsored schemes or central sector schemes, and you ensure, you aggressively push to argue that if you want the money for these schemes, if you're going to get some of these schemes in your state, then it has to be implemented the way we design it, and it has to be attributed to the center or to the party ruling at the center or the prime minister at the center. Now, if that is the case, what you're saying is you're trying to undermine the ability of state governments, particularly opposition state governments, to be able to actually use their development agenda, their economic and social infrastructure mandates to be able to win some degree of political legitimacy. You undermine that, you erode that, while you try to strengthen that of the party ruling in the center. And that has to be the intensification of the process of the squeeze on fiscal resources in the last 10 years has to be seen in the context of that shift which has occurred in terms of the way in which spending is now being controlled from the center. Now, this, of course, is taken to extreme limits, and it's taken to extreme limits in which whenever the states try to do something, immediately, there are charges of, central agencies are used. So if you try to, I'm not saying that there is or is not any corruption. Things would come out sometimes, but most often they don't. But the basic point is, you really have opposition state governments finding that their ministers and their activists, etc., are being investigated for all sorts of corruption when they're trying to mobilize more resources or undertake spending on infrastructural projects, etc. And when they try to use about a little bit of the money which they have for welfare schemes, etc., you call them revenue, whatever, whatever it is that term, these sweets which are being distributed and so on. And therefore, you constantly are trying to erode the legitimacy of the. And finally, the proof that this is actually a weaponization of the structure of devolution for political ends comes through from what is being said now. That listen, the political campaign at the state level is run by central political dignitaries, and they are done, or political actors, and they are done on the basis saying that, listen, please elect the same government at your state, which you have at the center, because that would be a double-engine sarkar. And if you have a double-engine sarkar, you're going to get the benefits of all of these schemes. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefits of these schemes, okay? And we know, look at the Delhi budget. Look at the way in which the total allocation for Delhi has increased with the coming of the new government, which we saw, over the last couple of days. So finally, what is the implication of this? The implication of this is that that no more is developmental spending constitutionally structured as a constitutionally structured transfer of resources, in which you basically are trying to find a framework of devolution to cover for an asymmetry which you find as needed because of the preferred modes of, preferred allocation of resource mobilization and spending responsibilities between the center and the states, but is not anymore constitutionally structured, but it is depends on the political character of the state government. And the larger aim seems to be political domination. So you can see that there are other indication of this, the call for simultaneous elections, the whole effort at delimitation based on more recent population figures, despite the more successful implementation of population control, population growth in say in the southern states, for example. And then why do you need this? Well, you seem to be needing this for multiple reasons. You need it to, what does the attack on what's the new education policy and the attack on education policy at the state level, on the attempt to control educational institutions, on the attempt to impose linguistic, religious, cultural homogenization across the country. So there is a larger political agenda for which you want political domination, perhaps. And that political domination is being achieved in multiple ways, including, with a majoritarian agenda in political practice. But more importantly, it's also being achieved by weaponizing what was considered to be merely a framework which would allow for ensuring that there is a distribution of taxation and spending powers between the center and the states, which is in keeping with the needs of effectiveness and efficiency, and really weaponizing it in a way in which it will allow you to get that political domination. So you really don't have a situation where you can see economic centralization and political centralization as being parallel tracks, or even to a certain extent as separate tracks. We're discussing two different things. In fact, we can see how they are related, but more importantly, how they've now increasingly merged in the new context in which we are placed, given the evolution through multiple stages. The recommendations of sequential recommendations of consecutive finance commissions, the coming of neoliberalism, of course, goes back to the end of one-party dominance, way back, decades back, and a more complex political mosaic where you have political parties ruling the states, which are different from political parties ruling the center, and so on. And in that context, we basically see the merging of political and economic centralization, which really, threatens the sustenance of the union. And that's why I think it is reflective of a nation in crisis. It's not just an economic crisis, but it's a larger national crisis. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor C P Chandrasekhar, for this exhaustive presentation. The challenges before us, how with the advent of BJP at the center, how things are being weaponized. Weaponization of devolution is also taking place. Process of devolution taking place. So very interesting presentation, and I am sure there will be a lot of questions and queries about the whole theme. But before we start taking up the queries in the chat box and also questions from the chat room, I will just request Comrade Ravi to say a few words on Professor Chandrasekhar's presentation. Then we'll take up the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhash. And thank you so much, Professor Chandrasekhar, for accepting our invitation and giving such an informative talk, very educational for people like me who would not be able to easily make sense of what goes on behind the scene in the these economic, financial, budgetary things. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and there will be very good discussion on the things that you have laid out. Let me start by asking you something more general, which might sound, falling a little bit outside the scope of what you have put out. But I think it is related to, it's about the value or objective or desirability of federalism. What is behind it? Let me just give the example that do you think that centralization or decentralization of power over resources, is that the main value for which we should have a federal structure, or it is a representation of various nationalities, subnationalities, cultures, and so on, India being such a multicultural, in a way, multinational country. So is representation, in your opinion, the main value, or decentralization is the main value? And the reason I am asking this question is that can federalism defend itself in the kind of democracy that we have? If it is decentralization, then it becomes an issue all over the country, more or less uniformly. Decentralization should be a good value for everyone. But if it is a representation, then certain states will have to play a bigger, larger role, have more reasons to play that role to defend federalism. So which one? And I might just add, a subsidiary question to that, in that context, this question of delimitation is coming up. And I often think, what argument should I make against delimitation? After all, we have a democracy in which one person, one vote is there. And delimitation, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that will underline the importance of equality of votes, individual votes, but that may go against aspects of federalism, as southern states are, or many states would be complaining against delimitation. So if I were to argue against delimitation, what argument should I have? What argument should I make? So let me see, if my questions are relevant and if you have what you have to say.
Well, first, let me say that, the reason I was focusing on fiscal federalism is because of where I come from. I'm an economist by training, and much of my work has been in that area. And definitely not. We're not talking about federalism being, crucial only because of the fact of this asymmetry between, what would be a preferred structure of mobilization of resources and allocation of developmental responsibilities. Federalism is important because of the fact that this is, as you put it, a very diverse country with very different, multiple languages, cultures, and so on and so forth. And there must be a way in which there must be governments and structures, not just at the state level, but even below the state level, which, based on the principle of subsidiarity, would be able to reflect the interests, the aspirations of the people in those contexts. So it's not. Of course, there's a national question. There's a question of how in that context do you actually keep together what's defined as the nation, and the other is there is a question of the fact that can that be sustained if you allow some kind of either population-based or state size-based sort of majoritarianism to ride roughshod over the diversity of cultures, of languages, and so on and so forth. So I think that's, state governments, and the big battle is there. All I was trying to say is that this whole issue of actually using resources of fiscal federalism and of actually fiscal centralization, not really fiscal federalism, no, fiscal centralization becomes an instrument which actually allows the pursuit of a larger agenda where a kind of majoritarianism is imposed on different states. That's the argument. But what is important is that you should actually have that diversity which is sustained on the basis of local governments and state governments, etc. So that's. I mean, I'm not by any chance saying that one is the other. Well, there are some. I mean, I can see Professor Balveer Arora there, and I'm sure he'll have more to tell you about how to, what would be the defense or criticism of the delimitation issue. But I mean, we know that there are two things. One is that if you basically say that there are some states which actually implemented what was seen as a national policy with regard to reining in the rate of population growth, considered to be an appropriate population policy, implemented it better and were more successful, and then you actually have either even a fiscal decentralization principle in which you give today's population more importance. You give resources to a state based on its population, then you deprive a state of resources because of the fact that it's successfully implemented a policy which was a national policy. It wasn't a state policy. Okay. Similarly, you will actually result in a situation where their representation at the central level will go down, and therefore the ability to be able to articulate the interests of their population, their cultures, etc., at the central level, where a lot of policy decisions are taken which affect the states, would reduce, so that there would be a greater ability of whatever representatives from states which have larger populations to be able to influence the policy agenda, and they have a problem with that. So that's one thing, and there is I don't know whether that's the best solution, but there are people who said, okay, even if you want to increase the number of states because the population has increased, if you want to give everybody a little bit more political space, then you increase it in the same proportion as you had, but you increase the total number of seats, so that there's a lot more representation, but you don't actually bias the shift in a way in which, I mean, the change or the increase in a way in which it actually also biases the issue of who influences the policy agenda. So there is an issue there. So
we are with us Dr. Balveer Arora. He's an expert on federalism. So, and he was there here also in the Democracy Dialogue. I request him to share his comment. Please.
It's done, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Subhaji. And I think I would like first to begin by congratulating Professor Chandrasekhar Chandru to us for this masterclass. Absolutely, absolute clarity, absolutely incisive. And I think, as Ravi said, it's been very educative for most of us. I think what he brought out very well, and the term that most fits what is happening, is the term of weaponization. I think these are not neutral formula. This is not devoid of politics. What has happened is that the masks have fallen. There is greater blatant manipulation of instruments which were designed to ensure equity and to ensure balanced growth. So what we are looking at, and I think Chandru hinted at that, is that we have to look at the overall objective. One nation, one culture is one such objective, and I think we need to take that very seriously because of the very skillful way in which all the weapons have been stacked on one side, and diminishing the capacity of states which would like to pursue their own, first of all, safeguard their autonomy, the limited autonomy that the Constitution gives them, but also try to carve their own path on the basis of their own achievements. Chandru mentioned this whole business of double engine sarkar the question of attribution and the weaponization of or the punishment, the vindictive and punitive federalism, where you withhold grants for very flimsy reasons. So this scenario that we are faced with, I don't know to what extent the 16th Finance Commission will bring any remedy to it, because as he very nicely pointed out, and I wish the central sector schemes and the central sponsored schemes, the same acronym CSS would change somehow. You could call it the central government schemes so that we don't mix up with these other CSS. On the question of delimitation, the issue is of preserving the existing ratios. And I think there is no argument against increasing the number of seats. So you've built the infrastructure. And we had a recent discussion with MPs. They feel that the size of their constituencies has grown so much that it's impossible for them to represent such large constituencies. So the basic idea of increasing the number of seats has something of a consensus among parties. What is important, of course, is that the federal balance not be totally disrupted, totally disturbed. And on that, better brains than mine are at work looking at the various formula. It's a tricky question. It's tricky because you are battling against an objective which doesn't actually favor the kind of equity that you are looking at. So I would again thank you, Chandru, for this very, very incisive and comprehensive. Within 1 hour, I know that you've done a wonderful, educated us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arora. But I must also apologize to you, because I know that there was one occasion when I made a similar, not exactly the same presentation when you were present, and I have tired you with it again.
No, it's always a pleasure, and I think you learn each time, so it's not a repetition.
Comrade Bhargav wants to share his questions. I will request him to unmute himself and.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandrasekhar, for this very, very instructive and educative presentation, and gave all the important aspects of the problem. I have 2-3 minor questions which are related to this. One is, after 2015, when 14th Finance Commission brought in a new paradigm in direct transfer to Gram Panchayats, bypassing state governments on the one hand, and the second hand, reducing its transfer to the state governments in the same respect. So it's a double-edged thing. By directly transferring to panchayats, it is in a way trying to reach out to rural areas directly. And if we add this development to the problem you have already identified, that the centrally sponsored schemes are projecting central government more. It is more of a political propaganda than a welfare that they are directly implementing, and they are doing the schemes and all that. So we see this diabolical combination. It's very clear. But secondly, but on the other hand, I also see the ratio of center's proportion in the centrally sponsored schemes have drastically, center's ratio has drastically gone down. If we compare with the UPA1 or UPA2 flagship programs, when they used to be, before 2015-14, they used to be roughly, many schemes, roughly center is 75% and 25% state used to contribute. And now more or less there is a, we can say on average, centers ratio has gone down to 60% and states are matching grant has increased to 40%, most of the cases, except the Prime Minister Gramin Sadak Yojana, which used to be 100%. Now it also came down to 60-40%. So how do we explain this? Because in many centrally sponsored schemes, the actual ratio of center's contribution has gone down, drastically gone down. So how do we understand this?
Okay, no, the first is, yeah, I think the first question, the issue that you raised, is not a question really, and I completely agree with you that, I mean, let us of course accept the fact that there are many state governments which have not done enough in terms of devolution beyond the state level, and even though there might be to a certain extent some kind of effort at political devolution, strengthening of Panchayati Raj institutions, when it comes to actual devolution of resources, very few states, in fact, I think one or two states really have done very much in this, and of course Kerala has taken the lead because of its whole decentralized planning experiment. So there is that issue. So we can actually say that, okay, if there is, that we can actually say that there must be a component of the Finance Commission's recommendations which say that subject to the states agreeing to do the following thing, this much of additional resources will be provided as a special grant for devolution purposes, or we will increase the percentage which will accrue to that state by so much, whatever it may be. You can think of some way where you actually link it. Because that's at least a better conditionality than a conditionality say which says that, listen, if you want to borrow more, you have to meet one ration card, one nation, one ration card, or and some such this thing. So yeah, I do think that, but in particular, I really share what you said about if you get into a situation of what you're trying to do is to use development expenditure as being a way of trying to garner political legitimacy, sometimes not even because the substance of what you're providing is so important, but because of the propaganda which accompanies the announcement and this thing of a scheme, is geared to winning political legitimacy. Which brings me to, which ties in with your second question. One of the ways in which the state share in many of these schemes has gone up, more than, because there is a particular way in which the scheme is designed by the center. And the center, even if it says that, okay, in that it's going to be a 60-40 division, which itself, as you said, we know that in many cases that involves already a decline of the center's contribution. But the center now wants to say that, okay, I'll give you 60% for this, but you have to implement it. This is my design. Then supposing the state government says that, listen, this design, we're already doing things which goes beyond this design. So supposing we take a health scheme where you have a minimal contribution in terms of an insurance premium, which is paid to an insurance company, which then provides a certain amount of support to a certain proportion of the population. And the state government says, listen, we have been trying to, define for ourselves a universalized health scheme, which is not purely based on insurance, that it is in part based on, free public provision. And, we establish both the infrastructure for that, and we establish a scheme for that. So what we want to do is we want to actually have the design of the scheme as follows. Or you say that, listen, the percentage of the population to whom I want to give food, I think is much higher. Of course, that mattered more before the coming of the recent increase under the NFSA. Now, in all those cases, what the center says, okay, if you want to do that, you go ahead and do it. But we're not going to give you the money for that. Not even the 60% we're giving or the 50% you're going to get. You outlay the whole amount. So that in many states, the actual scheme being implemented, which is better than the scheme as designed by the center, necessitates the states to put in, as you say, maybe put in 80%, maybe put in 75%, maybe put in 90%. So there's two ways in which. One, of course, there is an attempt to reduce the contribution. And the other is because your principal aim is propaganda, you're not really looking at providing a scheme with substance which will actually meet the objective for which that scheme is being designed. What you're trying to do is to say that, listen, here I am giving you the benefit of the scheme, and you announce this scheme, and you really make it a scheme which actually is not giving all that much. And but you want the benefits of the fact that the scheme is in place to accrue to you by being attributed to you. But if the state government says that, but this is not as good as what we are doing, and we want this is the way we want the scheme designed. They say in some cases they've said no, you can't do that. In the case of certain kinds of schools, special schools, and so on. On other cases, they say, oh, you want to do it, you put the money in, and therefore there's even a further increase. And this is part of the fact that you're doing this in order to win that legitimacy, not really doing it because of the substance of the scheme. And there, it is diabolical to actually have a direct transfer. But then this occurred not necessarily under the NDA. This approach to we had a Panchayati Raj minister who had intentions of bypassing state governments, on grounds which he justified, on other ideological grounds. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. But as I said, I agree. And it's not really an answering to your question, it's just to support what you said.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bhargav, please take up some questions in the chat box. Can you please? Yeah.
Please allow me to take question from chat box, and there is a question from Professor Veena Shatrugna. What happens if more and more states refuse the central schemes and use their scarce resources for prioritizing their population needs? And yeah, that's the question from Veena Shatrugna.
The problem with that is, if you have a fiscal squeeze, and you then say that, okay, if I want to have a rural employment guarantee scheme, and there's a limited amount to which I can do it on the basis of my own resources because of the fiscal crisis I'm facing. Here, the center is willing to give me whatever 60% or 50% or 60%. Let us say, if it's willing to give me 60%, I might as well use that and have a larger rural employment guarantee scheme. But if I don't, what's going to happen is the center is going to say that, listen, other state governments are doing much better than this state government because they've got much more broader scheme. And you would actually be losing out because of the fact that even though what you're doing is in the interest of your design of what would be in the interest of your population, you don't have the resources. They've squeezed you. That's the intention of generating the fiscal crisis, and therefore making you dependent on these centrally sponsored schemes and central government schemes, if I have to take Professor Arora's suggestion, on board. So that's the thing I see. It's actually a bit of a trap that if you're squeezed fiscally, and you're stuck with a set of schemes designed by the center, but if you don't take that, it'll be that you're not even doing that much because of the fact that there's only a limited amount you can do on the basis you have, and you don't even have the right now to be able to tax adequately because you've accepted. And of course, the state governments should accept the blame for two things: embracing fiscal conservatism with fiscal responsibility and budget management acts at the state level, which tied their own hands in terms of borrowing, and two, of course, accepting the GST. After all, there was an empowered committee in which there were representatives of opposition state governments. And they, at that point of time, thought it would be good for them. They were persuaded because they said, oh, you're going to, this is a game changer. It's not just going to be revenue neutral. It's going to be revenue enhancing. You're going to get more money, even though, so much of your taxing powers are getting subsumed under this national agenda. And you accepted that. And you then, of course, were persuaded that if initially there is some problem about you getting as much resources as you might have got, we are promising you a 14% increase, and if you don't get 14%, you'll be compensated. Now all that is over, and then they're realizing that they're not getting the revenues that they hoped that they would get out of it. Whether GST should be reformed or abolished, it should be very clear what I'm saying. This GST has to go. It cannot be sustained if the states are not to be in a complete fiscal crisis. But it has happened in other contexts where these things have been withdrawn.
We are with us Hardeep Grewal, Gary, our old friend, and he has raised some question in the chat box. I will request him to unmute himself and share his question. Gary, please. Gary, please.
Subhash, it's written out there. I mean, so you just want me to repeat that?
Yeah, please repeat that. Please repeat that.
Okay. So I keep on having these strange thoughts that what to do about the whole situation. And so as a hypothetical thing that you could do is that presume that you're God for a short while. And you have to function within the existing constitution, assuming that it will not be changed the way the BJP is trying to change it. Let's presume that that is the given. So what can be the best arrangement that can be done in the economic sense and partly in the political sense within the ambit of this constitution that just does justice to the poor of the people? That's my question. So what would be a hypothetical answer to that? That's all.
Well, that is a very big question. I can only hint on the directions in which we can possibly think in terms of formulating an answer. I do think there are certain things which we must give up. We shouldn't have adopted them in the first instance, but now must give up because the evidence is very clear that they've completely failed to deliver anything, even their own objectives, their own stated objectives. One, of course, is the whole idea that what you should do is to try and link yourself to global value chains, either through your own big businesses or through foreign investment, such that you become the manufacturing hub of the world, or the manufacturing come services hub of the world, or the next China, or whatever if you had any such that period was firstly, you didn't manage to do that despite so much liberalization. And we are talking about what? We are talking about 35 years now, more than that, 40 years of liberalization. And liberalization is one thing where there's no end to it. Every time you say that, oh, we're not doing well, they say that's because you're not liberalized enough. But you've been doing it for 40 years now. So the point is, so if you don't do that, what was the basic idea in the period of decolonization? The basic idea was that you needed to be able to grow on the basis of your own domestic market, based on a strategy in which that growth would not make you so dependent on imports from abroad, such that you're forced to become dependent on foreign capital, foreign borrowing, foreign debt, foreign investment, etc. And it was clear at that point of time that if you want to do that, there are two things which are important. One, of course, is that you must create your own mass market. Just putting tariffs and import substitution or protection is not enough. That creates a once-for-all market. Once the imports which were earlier coming into the country and are not coming and are being substituted, then you can have growth only if the market itself grows. And the understanding was that the only way in which you can have that growth is it has to be one in which you undermine asset and income inequality. You have to have land reforms in agriculture. Of course, now so much has changed in agriculture. It's not the same thing. It's a much more complex issue. And you need, of course, to undermine, which is much more glaring now, asset and income inequality in the non-agricultural, in the non-rural areas. Now, if you look at that, that was never done. I mean, despite it being talked about so much, of course, land reforms weren't implemented, and asset and income inequality has increased hugely. And that basically means that, I mean, if you do grow a market on that basis, what you're in some sense saying is that the market you're growing is on the basis of a more egalitarian distribution of income, which generates a market for mass consumption goods, for manufactured mass consumption goods, and that stimulates growth. Okay. And the second thing you need to do is to ensure that when that growth is occurring and you start producing to meet the demand, you don't produce largely on the basis of either imported goods, I mean, supplying imported goods, or on the basis of importing, capital goods and intermediates from abroad. You have to think of a strategy where you have an allocation of investment which reduces to a minimum the degree of foreign exchange you need based on your ability to be able to earn that foreign exchange or to obtain that foreign exchange through nonsense, which doesn't make you overtly excessively dependent on foreign finance. So, I mean, that's basically saying that, you cannot think of a growth strategy in which you think of a growth strategy which doesn't actually deal with inequality or is in fact inequalizing, increases the inequality, and you address the problems of the poor separately. What you're saying is actually preventing an inequality or reducing inequality generates for you the basis for growth. If you can do that, it's a system which will give you some growth, and it will be a system which actually gives you growth, which will share. I don't want to use the word inclusive, but which will share the benefits much more with the lower deciles or low income deciles of the population. Now, the point is, if you try to pursue a strategy of that kind, in as much as you have to challenge vested interests in order to be able to attack asset and income inequality, that the pursuit of that strategy itself is a stepping stone to major institutional change, because you'll have to actually challenge those forces which are underlie the asset and income inequality that you have. So it's really step one in a larger transition in which you're trying to bring about an institutional change of a kind, where the nature of growth itself is very different from the growth we have seen post the 1960s in almost every less developed country, and seen even in the so-called two successful less developed countries which made the transition to the developing countries, developed country status, which is South Korea and Taiwan. So it's really, it's envisioning a larger growth, growth trajectory, which has to be based on, it's predicated on major institutional change, and the process of that institutional change itself will change the nature of the growth strategy over a period of time. I know this is just a very general answer, but your question was so large that this is just a hint of possibly the way we can think about it.
Professor Chandrasekhar, as a response to your analysis, there is a suggestion from Mr. Ramana. I read that. I suggest 3 solutions. You may respond to it. 1, abolish all centrally sponsored schemes and include them back into Consolidated Fund of India that may correct the vertical imbalance towards 50:50. Second, reduce population weight to 20% and increase effort to raise own revenue to 40%. 3, increase overall tax GDP ratio to at least 25 to 30%. This alone would end all asymmetries. What do you say?
Well, number 3, I completely agree with that. I don't even see why we should stop at 30%. You can go with given the inequality in this country, if you actually start taxing wealth and you have an inheritance tax, along with the wealth tax, then you can take your tax GDP ratio, I think, to levels which are higher than 30%. But for a start, I agree with you. Let's go to 25 to 30%. Reduce the population weight to 20%. I don't know if you've played with these numbers. We've in the course of helping out colleagues in different state planning boards and so on, we've tried to play with these numbers. You can have different kinds of weights for different criteria. Population criteria on the share of agriculture, criteria on we can bring in different criteria and give them different weights. And the problem is going to be that in all of these, that it's while you might do something to improve the distribution between the center and the states, that is, you might improve vertical devolution, you could end up with a situation where there would be some states which would be losers because of the fact that the change in the weighting system affects them adversely. And any weighting system, so basically you're trying to choose a weighting system which doesn't upset too much the horizontal balance, even if you can't improve it, which is what you need to try and do. And on the other hand, improves the vertical balance. So it's not just a question of reducing population weight. It's actually trying to find yourself a whole set of weights. In fact, think even of new indices you take and give them a weight in the total formula to be able to determine both vertical devolution as well as the horizontal distribution of resources. The first, I'm not so sure that would help. If you abolish all centrally sponsored schemes and include them back into the Consolidated Fund of India, what you're in essence saying then is that, you're basically saying, well, I suppose what are you trying to say what we should have is we not have 42%. Let us say what you actually have is you have some 65% or 70%, that is, you basically say that, okay, you need only so much for defense and foreign affairs and so on and so forth. And the rest of the money you give to the states. So if that's what you mean by putting it into the Consolidated Fund of India, and then you don't need 50-50 because the money is in the states already. But yeah, then we should think of it in that fashion. It's not abolishing centrally sponsored schemes, actually saying these schemes become state schemes because the states actually have the money to spend on that. You don't need the center to come in. We don't need that third and fourth form of flow. The first two forms of flow, which is statutory grants through the Finance Commission and the formula which the Finance Commission prescribes for revenue sharing, puts enough resources in the hands of the states that it can do all of this. So it's really finding a way of how to get the states the money rather than saying, since the states don't have money, they're dependent on these schemes. How do you make those schemes better?
There is an overarching question from Dr. Bulisu Srinivas. It goes like this. Can you please highlight why southern states have economically developed while it is the Indo-Gangetic plains that are most fertile lands on the globe? The geography is hardly favorable for agriculture in the south, barring delta regions, and why population increased exponentially in these northern states despite poverty in the last half a century.
Yeah, you're asking for a full explanation of what accounts for the regional differentiation in development performance across the country. There are many elements to it, and for each element I cite, you will be able to cite another one. So I think it would be too much for me to try and answer such a large question, but I'll definitely think about it. Yeah. And also, some of the things one might say if I don't think about it properly, may also be politically incorrect. So I don't want to get into that trap.
Okay. And there is a question and a comment from Mrs. Malati Palla. Thank you so much, brilliant session. The recommendations by Financial Commission being advisory in nature and not binding, can the government differ from accepting them? Or if the government has been abiding by them, why the states face the issue in fiscal federalism, assuming the Finance Commission is a politically neutral body?
Well, the government which has to accept it is really the center, because what the Finance Commission is saying is what's going to be the devolution of the center of the states. And what the states have to accept is the way in which, once there's an aggregate devolution, what is going to be the distribution between the states. Okay. Now, does the center have to accept the recommendations of the Finance Commission? No, it need not accept the recommendations of the Finance Commission. But that might have mattered that might have been a possibility if we actually begin to think that finance commissions are completely independent technocratic organizations which are looking to ensure equity and fairness. But what I was sort of suggesting is that there is reason to fear, or believe as we go over time, that increasingly finance commissions have become less and less independent. And also a lot of members of the Finance Commission have been influenced by, neoliberal ideologues of one kind or another. So it suits the central government very often. These recommendations suits them. So it would prefer to accept them rather than to actually say that we don't accept them, even if it involves a little bit of sacrifice on its part, which it can then take care of by the kind of accounting practices which I had mentioned in the thing. On the other hand, if the states accept the vertical devolution, they can't say we won't accept the horizontal devolution, because that is really, saying they can when they make their presentations before the Finance Commission, make a case for themselves getting more. But finally, once a formula is prescribed for what's going to determine horizontal devolution, states would find it difficult to say, no, why are you giving so much to so-and-so and give more to me and less to them?
The question is, if the GST is to be reformed, if at all, how it is to be reformed? There is one way: you just abolish GST, not in this current form, but as a phenomenon. Or you reform it. If it is to be reformed, what are the specific measures that are needed to reform it? Thank you.
My personal view, based on my understanding of it, that it should be abolished. that it actually is it actually is not constitutional. It actually undermines the taxing rights of the states. And if it undermines the taxing rights of the states, it undermines federalism. And the argument that, you should be willing to accept that sacrifice because of the fact that the net result is going to be an increase in revenue has been completely smashed. First, it was attributed to some glitches, some, reporting, shortfalls, some computer problems with the software which Infosys or whatever was provided, etc., etc. This went on for a long time. Now all that is over. You can't be teething all your life, So, so now it's clear that you're not even getting the revenues, and in principle, it is something which completely undermines federalism. So I think it should just go.
No, that is very clear. But my point was, in other countries also there is GST. So is there any other form? The current mechanism of GST has to be abolished.
No,
but
two
is
things.
there any way out? What is the way out?
Two things. I mean, take for a country which has, which has a strong sort of, a federal sort of, structure. Take a country like the United States. It doesn't have something like this. I mean, no state is going to completely hand over cede its, its rights completely. There will be state taxes, which will be there along with the federal taxes. There have been countries in Africa and elsewhere where they initially started with a value-added tax, which is similar to the GST, and then realized that it was not working, and they went back on it. So, so I don't think even international experience warrants us from retreating. I'm sorry to be so dogmatic, but I don't think even the international experience warrants us from retreating from the position. I mean, the one person who was very clear from the very beginning was Dr. Ashok Mitra. I mean, he right at the beginning said that, listen, no state should accept this. This is completely against federal principle. Poor man, before, he was working to go to the Supreme Court on this issue, but before that, we lost him. But yeah, there were people who believed that this should not be implemented. It was just that the propaganda which came and the ability to be able to win even the support of some state governments resulted in a situation where we are stuck with this, and it's a failed experiment. So we should find a way of transiting out.
Well, Subhash, I can maybe, since we have hold of Professor Chandrasekhar, I am tempted to ask something which is totally outside the scope of today's lecture. But since, we still have a few minutes, I mean, we have the example of China next door, which is, of course, has been phenomenal, I mean, from they were as bad as we were around 1978 when Deng Xiaoping's, kind of phase started, and they have kind of astonished the whole world, the way they have developed, In India, especially in our progressive left movements, we have focused more on the question of equality and justice, and so on, which is a must, which is the first thing to do. But what kind of balance or proportion between the question of justice and distribution and equality versus growth and creation of value based on the one hand, a very strong role played by the state, a state which is very strategic and quite visionary on the one hand, and also using private sector, using capitalism, using global capitalism. They have hit a sweet spot, and they have appear to make a good combination. And they are also helped by the fact that they have a very homogeneous population and a civilizational state, which is being carried by the civilization, even though West often complains that they don't have democracy. So they have the most shining example today in terms of growth, as well as in terms of fairly distributing prosperity and bringing growth to, distributing growth to the population. Not ideal, but, it appears, the best that you can see in the world today. Now, the reason I am mentioning that, is that if we were to think about India, the challenges that India faces, beyond the political challenges of Hindutva fascism or neoliberalism and the kind of crony capitalism that has come, if one were to think on behalf of India in an ideal situation, what kind of strategic plan do you think India has? Do we have something to learn from China today, or can we see it in positive light and try to imitate it?
Well, I'm not a China expert, but one or two things. First, it may not be fair to say that China was in 1978 or around that time when the reform was supposed to have begun, was in the same place where India was, because I think one big thing, couple of big things is firstly by 1978, already the share of manufacturing in China's GDP was something like close to 40%. It was 38, 39%. Okay. Which means that the manufacturing transition had occurred. Even if you say that consisted of a set of public sector enterprises which were not the most efficient or whatever, how we define efficiency, whatever it might say, but there was a significant structural change which put the country on a trajectory in which it could get the benefits of productivity increase, which is characteristic of the technological trajectory we've had. There are limits to productivity increases in predominantly agriculture or primary producing societies, and those limits are relaxed once you diversify, and China had diversified. That's point number one. Point number two, we cannot deny that by that time, their investments in human capital, etc., had actually were quite substantial in terms of, come on, we haven't put our children to school, even now, they not only put their children to all their children to school, they also had, was it competitive, but they had, significant advance in terms of enrollment into higher education institutions, significant presence in the STEM discipline, and so on and so forth. It is not just a few IITs. This is a little more general. The thing is what we must recognize is, the problem I see post that, I wouldn't be as, as celebratory about what happened, is that what happened after 1978 is not merely the reform, which, let's say, removed unnecessary or maybe even discriminatory regulatory measures, some of which were not even achieving their objectives and so on. I'm not talking about that, but what really happened is, that involved a shift to a growth trajectory in which you had exports constituting a major driver of economic growth in China, and a significant chunk of that exports came from foreign invested enterprises. Okay. There is first still the puzzle. Why exactly did the capitalist world, in particular the US and of course and Europe, allow China to invade their markets the way it invaded, for a country of its size to be able to register for 30 years something like close to 10% rates of growth? So the whole thing is it achieved this. It achieved this. There is a puzzle. And why exactly didn't it happen? Because it's going to be difficult for India to do it now. You're not going to be able to have an America or Europe, which today is going to accept India invading their markets in the same way, because given our size and dimensions, we also would need to invade markets in order to be able to get that kind of, 8 to 10% rates of growth for a period of 30 years or whatever it may be. But the point is, it is not only that it had, that it actually got onto this risky trajectory of being dependent on these external markets, but to do that, it actually had to sacrifice domestic consumption and maintain very high levels of investment. Okay, so it was not that it didn't bother enough about equality, but emphasized growth. It actually used inequality and, migrant workers and, without huko rights and so on, to be able to generate that strategy. Okay. So, and also it had at some point of time to start making concessions. People thought that the concession of joining the WTO itself is going to be affected badly, but we know that what actually happened is China benefited more from WTO than other countries benefited from China joining the WTO. But it did lose out in terms of having to open up to a certain extent its financial sector, where there are problems of different kinds. So the way I see it is, therefore, I mean, it got this to a trajectory which was very, I think it's very risky trajectory. It makes you prone to encirclement in a world which doesn't like you, growing at the pace you're growing and becoming as important as you are, given your history, which is not a history of being a market-based democracy, and whatever within inverted commas. But yeah, it worked. I agree with you. It worked in terms of growth, and worked partly that growth rode on and rising inequality. The plus point I really think is the realization in China, for whatever it may be, that this cannot go on. So you've got to, so all this rebalancing is multiple rebalancing. You want to now build your domestic market, which as opposed to being dependent export markets. Building your domestic markets means challenging inequality, because you need to actually have incomes which actually lead to more mass consumption, etc. So we might see a correction. We might see a correction which actually leads to it. But I do think that, given that history and what it had achieved before 1978, and given the very unusual willingness of the rest of the world to accept what happened in China, this is not a replicable trajectory. We can't say that, can India try to achieve that? I think for India, it's better to go back to where we were at and see how can we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps based on our domestic market. And in the process, do that in a way in which we ensure a greater degree of asset and income equality. And I think that's the way for us to go. It's not really trying to imitate this trajectory, because we neither have the background to have got into the trajectory successfully, nor do we have the international circumstances in which one more country is going to be allowed to do that. At least I don't think so.
May I ask now?
Please, Ramana, please.
Prof. Chandrasekhar, once again, quickly 2 questions. There are some states which have got perpetual revenue deficits like Northeast, which we can't do much about them. But there are some backward states like UP and Bihar, which are having perpetual revenue account deficits, or because of their own discipline and inefficiency. So, can't there be some kind of a time limit or a one-time grants or to lift their economy so that their revenue accounts can be brought into balance? One question. Second question is, there must be some impositions of development, non-development expenditure limit ratios on states, so that they judiciously use on education, health, these things. And then because now only revenue capital expenditure is allowed to borrow, and then revenue expenditure is domestically put. But the capital expenditure, and in this context, even the capital expenditures which are borrowed are not necessarily used very efficiently. Telangana is a big example where our previous TRS government has borrowed heavily and put it into most uneconomical projects. So there must be some mechanism of disciplining. I don't know whether it should be externally imposed or it should be internally brought out, but some institutions are missing, which are actually going to bring these problems. I'm sorry for being a long question.
No, I know it is true that, the focus of my my presentation was really looking at, so basically it is, basically I was looking at the vertical devolution issue, and looking at how the center, on average, the states are getting completely squeezed out. That doesn't mean we are not talking about a situation in which there's inadequacy, shortfalls, misallocations, etc., and functioning in not just a few, in most state governments you can find, with varying degrees of intensity in terms of the extent of the delinquency or the deviation or whatever you want to call it that. So yeah, so if you say that, do we need to correct for that? Yeah, you need to correct for that. Some of it, I think, is because of the fact that we are, this whole system is embedded in capitalism. And if it's embedded in capitalism, you cannot have a state which is completely independent of the complexities associated or the shortfalls and failures associated with what is a capitalist regime, and that reflects itself also in state fiscal performance. But the other thing is, even to the extent that there is these things and they need to be corrected, and we should think of measures for that. This cannot be on the basis of either central discipline, or it definitely cannot even be on the basis of discipline of an entity which is constituted wholly by the center, which is what the Finance Commission is. In fact, most people who like the Finance Commission concept even talk about the need for a fiscal commission, which constantly is there always, not once in 5 years, which is constantly playing the role of a domestic IMF, which is trying to fiscally discipline state governments, etc. This would only worsen the situation, because we're not talking about, who is to monitor the monitor? Who's going to actually make sure that the disciplining agent is not in itself, not merely indisciplined, but in addition to being indisciplined, is disciplining not with the objective of ensuring, what do we call good fiscal performance or good fiscal behavior, but really is intervening in order to be able to pursue a political agenda, which is what seems to be the case, So, we need public pressure to be able to force state governments to be more fiscally responsible, even though my view is that fiscal responsibility does not consist in borrowing less. I don't even mind a little bit of borrowing to finance revenue deficits, so long as the allocation of the borrowed money is such that it meets the larger development and welfare needs of the state. So it's not fiscal deficit saying, oh, why are you spending so much, or why are you borrowing so much? It really is saying that, listen, what is the best way in which you can expand your fiscal space and utilize the expanded fiscal space through allocations which actually further the development and welfare objectives. So I would put it like that way, that we need more understanding of and more advocacy of policies of that kind, but it need not be, the issue is not disciplining. The issue is actually correcting for the shortfalls or the failures, which, as I said, partly comes from the fact that this is embedded in a market economy, which itself is constantly characterized by grand failures, And so part of the failure is also reflected in fiscal failure. But it can be corrected, and to the extent that it be corrected, it has to be corrected by public pressure at the state level, but not by some central force or centrally sponsored force coming and implementing a discipline. That's the way I do it.
So we move toward conclusion. Thank you very much for this exhaustive and educative presentation, and the way you explained the unfolding, what you called federal fracture, and it really, like, we could understand the nuances of it. Thank you, audience, for being here, and keep attending our next meeting also. So thank you all. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.